Tonight, claims of secretly dismembering and selling body parts in the hours after a death.
The FBI is talking to people. We're talking to people.
He took an open bottle of embalming fluid and just threw it across the room so it hits the floor, hits the wall, and spills everywhere.
Is that dangerous?
Very dangerous.
He says his boss also started making terrifying threats, Barry thinks, to keep him quiet.
He threatened to kill my parents and to kill me, to cremate me alive. I work around dead bodies for a living. I have a very strong stomach, but this made me sick.
They say you betrayed their trust to make money, to sell body parts.
Tonight, a funeral home owner and her parents now under investigation by the FBI.
The funeral services industry in the United States alone, funeral homes, crematoriums, and cemeteries, etc., generates about $15 billion in annual revenue worldwide, according to the 2012 Funeral Services Report from the Research and Markets. How a 1960s comet exposed the funeral industry's greed. When the average family went to book a funeral, they were provided with options for floral arrangement, caskets, burial plots, and more, all varying in luxury and finance. It was no accident that the price went up as well. One woman, a British-born, left from an aristocrat family, suspected a ruse. She found that funeral directors and, they had become adept in advertising and upselling to the grieved. But a wall of silence around the topic of death protected this booming industry in its methods. In 1963, when Jessica Mitford published her landmark work and book of investigative journalism, The American Way of Death, All Change. Jessica Mitford exposed the particular and often dubious ways the funeral industry had made the average service more expensive. This details remained relevant for more than 50 years later. In the 1960s, a funeral was likely to be the third largest expense in their lifetime, following only a house and a car. This had been made possible, Mitford concluded, because the funeral directors had perpetrated a huge and expensive practical joke on the American public. The funeral industry, they would estimate how much the deceased had left and price their services accordingly. She found her undercover work that the funeral directors worked deliberately to organize their casket showrooms to ensure higher sales. When she posed as a grieving, relative, those people, many if not all, misled her in saying that the embalming process was mandatory by law. It wasn't. The funeral industry began to get worried about her, being a whistleblower, and attempted to defame her, and, calling her a communist, evil commie and all this stuff for her radical sympathies, but they failed miserably because everyone could see through, the greedy, funeral industry, The environmentalism effects and cost of the funeral industry. In just 1 year, the amount of basket wood buried is equivalent to about 4 million acres of forest and rainforest. This wood and other resources could be used for more effective purposes, such as the amount of wood used in casket making can supply the wood needed to build over 90,000 homes. When you think about the 4 million acres of forest laid into the ground each year, it raises the question, is there even room to still bury people? If you drive past, your local cemetery of your local city or town, you'll see that all look really, really full. Research shows that if you add up the square footage of all the cemeteries in the United States alone, it measures 1 million acres of land. Let's start with the direct costs of embalming fluid. First off, the price you pay for it. The latest data from the National Funeral Directors Association, the NFDA, shows that the average cost of embalming for a traditional funeral is $750. That's an increase of $55 between 2014 and 2019. In most areas, the embalming process is going to cost between $500 and $800, but there can, be related costs as well. Many people choose embalming fluid because they want their loved one to look asleep and natural and look as much natural as possible at a viewing or memorial service. Part of making that happen requires what is called an aesthetic preparation. It's the second part of the embalming process and can cost between $100 to $40 and on top of the actual embalming processes. The environmental cost of embalming fluid. There is a lot more cost involved with the embalming fluid beyond the price. Few people realize that most embalming fluid is full of highly toxic formaldehyde, and also don't realize that toxic formaldehyde is leaking into the soil and ground and water supply at alarming rates every year. The NFDA's research has found that about 5.3 million gallons of embalming fluid are used a year. Unfortunately, around 827,000 gallons of the embalming fluid leaks out into the soil and waterways. This happens because the embalming fluids that's left over is put down a drain and the fluid flushes out of the person's artillery system. Part of the reasoning embalming is so expensive is because the materials used are very extremely dangerous. This, chemical is a very lethal thing. The funeral director is put at risk every time they use this embalming fluid. Over the past 4 years, cremations have surpassed burials as the most popular end-of-life option in the United States. According to the National Funeral Directors Association, cremation, along with those creative ways to honor the dead, is often marketed as a more environmental-friendly option. However, it's not really. But while it's true that cremation, is a less harmful way than pumping a body full of, toxic chemicals and burying it on top of concrete, there's still an environmental toll that takes, place to consider. Cremation requires a lot of fuel, and it results in millions of tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. In India, Hindus have a long tradition of cremating relatives on an open-air prairie, which requires cutting down millions of trees and forests, and the practice contributes to air and river pollution since most PYRE prior cremations occur near water. Some people with environmental concerns select so-called green burials, believing that poisonous embalming fluid still casts a cement burial vaults damage to the environment. Proponents of green burials use biodegradable caskets and endeavor to return the deceased to earth as naturally as possible without the use of chemicals. As a general rule, green burials avoid the use of any embalming fluid. Green burials can also be considerably less costly than traditional burials. Failed autopsies, false arrests, a risk of bias and death examinations. Disastrous errors by coroners and/or medical examiners have raised the questions about whether they are influenced by bias or police bias, etc., and had a close relationship with the police. The nation's death investigation system, a patchwork of medical examiners, freelance experts, and elected coroners who may or may not have medical training, is responsible for examining suspicious and unexplained deaths. Wrapped in the mantle of scientific authority, its practitioners translate the complexities of disease, decomposition, toxicology reports, and physics into simple categories like, is it an accident, is it a homicide, or death by natural causes, setting in motion the legal system's gravest cases and wielding tremendous influences over the juries and the jury system. Police killed roughly 30,000 people between 1980 and 2018, about 17,000 more than what's recorded in a federal database on police killings, according to a new study published on Thursday. In the report, researchers at the University of Washington pointed to clinical errors as well as substantial conflicts of interest between the medical examiners and the police department as reasons for the major discrepancy. Medical examiners and coroners face pressure to underreport police killings because many of them work for or are embedded within police departments. According to the study, which was published in the medical journal The Lancet, for example, back in 2017, 2 medical examiners from San Juan County in California quit after alleging the county sheriff pressured them to alter the autopsy results for deaths that occurred in police custody. Some medical examiners have also been accused of providing cover for the police and the police department during criminal trials. For example, attorneys for Derek Kevin, the former Minneapolis police officer who murdered George Floyd in May of 2020, enlisted Mayland's former chief medical examiner to testify in court as the expert witness during the trial. Despite overwhelming evidence showcasing that the police officer, murdered, the victim, The medical examiner, Dr. David Fowler, testified that the cause of death should have been left undetermined. He also said that George Floyd had died of a sudden heart rhythm disturbance as a result of heart disease and carbon monoxide poisoning from a vehicle exhaust. Brought to light racist trends in medical examiner diagnoses, the Times found doctors have used sickle cell trait disproportionately found in black people to help explain away instances of anti-black violence by the police departments. On top of that, a study published last year by the Journal of Forensic Sciences found evidence of cognitive bias when 133 forensic scientists were presented with identical medical evidence in a hypothetical case involving children's deaths and child deaths. The deaths were more likely to be ruled an accident if the child was white and the caregiver was a grandmother. They were more frequently ruled a homicide when the child was black and being cared for by the mother's boyfriend. The study, whose authors include Dr. Carter, touched on the very essence of the simmering debate over forensic pathology. It showed its authors said that judgments that ought to be based on science can become clouded by prejudice when medical examiners allow their findings to be affected by information that is not medically relevant. When it comes to true crime cases, here are some of the victims of, these industries. Amberly McLean Bernard, born 6 weeks premature in rural Mississippi, weighed less than 5 pounds when doctors sent her home. She did not cry and barely ate when they sent her home, her mother said, and not 2 days later, she began to have horrible, situations happen to her. She began to gasp for breath, and her health was being severely affected, and her mother rushed her to the nearest emergency room in the area, but the baby was already turning blue. The medical team was on code blue and did everything they could, including pumping air into the baby's lungs, trying to force a IV line into Amberly's neck and scalp, and, prodding her with a rectal thermometer, but her vital signs kept failing. After 4 hours, they gave up, and she eventually sadly passed away and died. A state medical examiner concluded that the death had not occurred because of a medical problem, but had been a homicide, the result of blunt force injuries with signs of strangulation. The mother, a 29-year-old black mother with 2 small other children, was charged with capital murder. The mother, she was stunned. The emergency room doctor who had tried to save the baby was also shocked, but Dr. Joyce Carter, a forensic pathologist tapped by the defense to review the case, saw a all too familiar pattern. A medical examiner who made the ruling without talking to the doctor or even examining the hospital records. Supervisors who signed off on his decision. A criminal justice system that as all too often sends black people to prison on evidence that might not have convicted someone else. In court, Miss McLean and her lawyer recalled Miss McLean was called a monster. She spent almost a year in jail before Dr. Carter's autopsy reviewed forced the state medical examiner and prosecutor to acknowledge that the baby's injuries could have been explained by the desperate attempts to save her that night. Before getting involved in the case of Amberly's death in Mississippi, Dr. Carter had spent much of her career taking on the issues of racial bias in the forensic profession and the departments. She realized that there was virtually no pipeline to train and recruit people of color in her profession, even though more than half of homicide victims in the country are black. Later on, she heard absurd claims from her fellow medical examiners, including that black people, didn't suffer as much pain as white people. That racist myth, and the bruises could not be detected on darker skin. She came to believe that the lack of cross-culture training was causing mistakes with large consequences. Some of those rectifications became apparent during the forensic pathology residence in the 1980s when she was the only black pathologist in the office of the medical examiner in Miami. Poor black women were turning up dead in dismal settings, cheap hotels, abandoned buildings, open fields, etc. Though the women were found in similar poses, the deputy medical examiner believed that their deaths had just been triggered by a combination of cocaine and voluntary sex. Nearly all were classified as drug-induced incidents, but Dr. Carter pushed back. The victim she examined had severe crack habit, but Dr. Carter declined to call the death an accident. She was right. After a public outcry, the autopsies were reviewed and re-examined, and injuries were found that had been overlooked and dismissed. All the deaths that, of that case were all reclassified as homicides. After Kane McGilly died in January 2009, her body was brought to New Orleans morgue, a dingy makeshift facility in a converted funeral home, for Dr. Paul McGarry to autopsy. Kane, 43, had died after being held in a cell in the parish jail bound to a metal bed by 5-point leather restraints. During the autopsy, McGarry observed multiple fresh and recent injection sites on her arms. He determined that drugs, he didn't specify the variety, had killed her according to his report, but doctors who had treated her the day she died encouraged her father, Mike McGilly, to look more closely into his daughter's death. It was concluded that McGarry had misconstrued the needle marks on her arms, as in fact all the needle puncture marks were therapeutic drawing blood IVs, that sort of thing. It had nothing to do with drugs. McGarry's findings also were contradicted by a central piece of evidence. A screen for drugs and alcohol didn't turn up in her system or in her blood. McGarry had reached his conclusion days before he got the test results record showed. Larison soon pinpointed the real reason for McGilly's demise. On the day of her death, the victim had gone to the hospital to be treated for an asthma attack. She was arrested soon after an altercation with hospital staffers. Peering at McGilly's lung tissue under a microscope, it was certain that severe asthma combined with the way she was restrained at the jail had caused her death. Kane McGilly's father is still seeking justice in this case. Mike McGilly has sued McGarry, the person who did the autopsy, in New Orleans Parish Court, saying his actions were extreme and outrageous, and has filed a separate suit against the the sheriff's department, for wrongful death. McGarry had been wrong, and it's not the first time. In fact, a review of his medical records and court documents and legal transcripts shows McGarry has had a history of making errors and oversights in autopsy after autopsy, over and over again. In 3 instances since 2005, his findings in cases in which people died in the custody of police officers has been challenged by doctors brought in to perform second autopsies. In each case, McGarry's findings cleared officers of wrongdoing. The other specialties concluded the deaths were homicides. Garrett Arthur, a victim, a 45-year-old construction worker with a history of drug arrests, died after a struggle with police on a New Orleans street in 2006. Based on McGarry's findings, coroners ruled that the death was an accident, but a forensic pathologist with a Georgia Bureau of Investigation brought in by Arthur's family to perform a second autopsy opinion found 4 broken ribs that McGarry had not noted or been talked about. In his report, the GBI pathologist also stated that McGarry's failed to dissect any key neck muscles, causing him to miss hemorrhages in that area. In his view, suggested Arthur had been strangled. No criminal charges have been brought in connection to Arthur's death. His family settled a lawsuit against the police department last year for $50,000. Another victim, also in 2006, McGarry autopsied Lee Diamond Smith, a 21-year-old man who died in jail in Gulfport, Mississippi. McGarry decided that Smith had been killed by a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lungs. Based on the evidence of internal bleeding, again with another specialist brought in to do a second autopsy, found injuries that McGarry had not abrasion on Smith's forehead and chest, as well as a half a dozen bruises on his legs and arms and hands. The doctor concluded that Smith, like Arthur, had been strangled. No criminal charges, again, have been filed in this death either. Raymond Barr, another victim, a 48-year-old handyman who died shortly after an encounter with police in the police department, was autopsied by McGarry in 2005. Based on McGarry's examination, Coroner Marryard declared Roburn's death an accident. Robburn was the victim of a beating. His autopsy report stated, ultimately in 2010, after conducting an extensive investigation, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted New Orleans police officer Melvin Williams for allegedly beating Robert to death and charged another officer with allegedly trying to help cover up the situation. In In Philadelphia, 3 funeral directors sold hundreds of bodies to a former oral surgeon who allegedly collected the bones, tissues, and skin from the corpses to be used in transplants. The 244 bodies fetched about $1,000 each. The grand jury found, with the body parts being transplanted in unsuspected medical patients worldwide, Michael Mastrano, who operated Vital Medical Tissue Services of Fort Lee, New Jersey, ran a scheme with the help of a team of cutters who stole the body parts. But some of the tissue he obtained came from people who had died of diseases such as AIDS or cancer. Some had other diseases as well. He made up documents, insisted there was a more bargain cause of death. PVC pipe replaced bones removed from the bodies. The body parts for sale ring made $4.7 million over 4 years by illegally obtaining the bodies and selling body parts to the hospitals and other health care providers for transplant into unsuspected patients. The tissue recipients that were left to wonder whether they contracted these hidden illnesses. Some of the parts sold to the medical companies were used for dental implants, knee replacements, and other procedures. Dozens of investigations into the deaths in California have been thwarted because victims' bodies were harvested for parts and pro-surveillance before the investigation has been legal, provided that the coroner agrees, which means they're just gonna take the organs out, and maybe donate them or something. But a Los Angeles Times investigation found dozens of cases where the coroner was left guessing at the cause of death because body parts were harvested early as a result of malpractice suits, couldn't even be proven, and even a murder charge had to be dropped because of lack of evidence. When a 69-year-old Marcia Jean died in September 2016, police had already been called to her home several times on and off because of reports of a possible abusive situation. A detective described conditions at the woman's home in Gardena as horrendous. She was so emaciated and frail that at the hospital asked Los Angeles County Adult Protective Services to look into her death. Yet by the time the coroner's investigator was able to examine her 70-pound body, her bones from her legs and arms were already gone and harvested.